Welcome, everybody, back to another edition of the Deep Cover podcast. We're in the late stages of the offseason in the NFL, and that means that there's been a few deals here and there that had to get ironed out. And two QBs got their deals, and I kind of want to talk about one of them. So the first is Miami re-signed Tua Tagovailoa to an extension. Big deal for him. And, he has played incredibly well, top 5 in the last statistics. So he's going to get a lot of money, whatever, right? The second, which has been one that's been a little bit more controversial, I think, in the wake of it being signed, is Jordan Love getting 4 years, $220 million from the Green Bay Packers. And there's been a lot of talk about that contract, but it made me think a little bit about just the difficulty that comes with the position of playing quarterback in Green Bay. And I kind of want to dive into that, dive into Jordan Love, and dive into this extension and really what it all means in the grand scheme of things for the Packers, for Love, and for the NFC North. So, if you're not familiar already, a quick rundown on how this all happened. So Jordan Love is drafted in the late first round by the Green Bay Packers while Aaron Rodgers was still on the team, and it can be argued while he was still in his athletic prime as a Packer quarterback. Obviously, he didn't take too kindly to them drafting his replacement in the first round. Much similar to how Rodgers' predecessor, Brett Favre, did not take too kindly to him being selected when he was coming out of Cal, also late in the first round. So the Packers kind of, I think, saw the writing on the wall that maybe Aaron wasn't going to be around forever and decided to start ahead and get into the next era and find his heir apparent and whatever. They do it. Aaron gets mad. He then unlocks another gear. And, Green Bay just kind of is like sitting there and letting this guy sit for 2-3 years and, not really just dealing with it because Aaron was playing at a MVP caliber level. Fast forward, the breakup happens between the Packers and Rodgers. Rodgers signs with the Jets, and that inserts Jordan Love into the conversation as their starting quarterback, right? And that's what happened last year. Love had I'd say a rough first half of the season, really turned on the second half, led them to the playoffs, and it really felt like there was a lot of buzz and good things happening for the Packers and for Jordan Love. It felt like they found another really good player at the very least, right? You didn't know if he was going to be Favre or Rodgers, but it seemed like he was kind of a good pick, good player, has all the tools, and could win them a lot of games. So, and then you look at Rodgers, he obviously went to the Jets, got injured, and then you start to wonder if you're a Packer fan, like, oh, it looks like we maybe made the right decision, right? So that leads into his contract negotiations. The thing about it is because he sat for so long, 3-4 years, before really getting his opportunity, all that team control that you typically get on a rookie deal kind of is non-existent for Green Bay, and you could argue that that's just poor asset management there, but you got one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time from a talent perspective, and if he's still playing well, you're going to have him as your guy, right? So you can't really fault Green Bay too much for that, but nevertheless, he was eligible for a contract extension, and they maxed him out, right? They made him the highest paid QB in NFL history, actually, $55 million a year. And I think that in this league, if you show that you could be not even like elite quarterback, if you could be a top third quarterback, a top 10 quarterback in this league, you're going to get big money, right? And they're going to pay you that way because it's the most important position in the league, right? There's no way around it. Quarterback matters more than other positions, whether you want to admit it or not. If you're a guy who loves defensive line play or offensive line play or your receivers or whatever the case, that's fine. None of that stuff happens without good quarterback play. We've seen countless teams with good defenses, good receiving cores, good running backs get limited because their quarterback just wasn't up to stuff, right? So that is something that you're always going to have to pay a premium for. So when it comes to him getting the contract, I we'll get into this a little bit later about money, but it's always timing. Like, you're going to get the biggest contract or close to the biggest contract because of when you sign. And eventually, as it ages, that contract will become more valuable because of more players had gotten paid since then, right? But let's look at Green Bay in the context of moving forward. Last season, I thought, was a really interesting year in the NFC North because Rodgers had moved on, right? And so the guy who was really the apex predator of that division for so many years was gone. And he is being replaced by a young guy that at the time you didn't know if he's going to be any good. Detroit then is coming up, and they had their best season in 30 years and did that behind Jared Goff, who's proven to be an excellent starting quarterback for them. Minnesota was kind of winding down the Kirk Cousins experiment, and they've decided that they're going to move forward and go in another direction. They're going to be rebuilding. They're probably going to be bad to mediocre for the next couple of years. And Chicago, who hasn't been able to stay out of their own way for God knows how long, they get a lead receiver in Rome Odunze in the draft, and they get their quarterback of the future, Caleb Williams, who's probably going to be starting right away. And now you kind of look at this division. What once appeared to be, well, the Lions are going to run this division now, has turned into, well, not so fast. This division might be incredibly and insanely competitive moving forward. Jordan Love looks like he has the tools to be a good QB. They got receiving weapons like Romeo Doubs that, have been shown to be effective. They bring in Josh Jacobs in free agency, so their running game is good. Their defense played pretty decently last season as well. A lot of young talent on Green Bay, so they are going to get better. Then you look at Chicago, it's hard to ignore. Caleb Williams is one of the most sought-after prospects in many, many years, okay? And Rome Odunze, when you watched him at Washington last year, it looked like he was going to be it. He looked like an NFL receiver playing against those Pac-12 defensive backs. And they, for the first time in their franchise history, it feels like, Chicago has started to really surround their quarterback with a lot of skill position players, a lot of threats that are going to potentially really open up the offense. So we could see some good stuff from the Bears. In the immediate future, I think that it's really a two-team division between Detroit and Green Bay. Minnesota and Chicago will be coming later on as their young quarterbacks develop. But if you're Detroit, you're thinking, okay, here we were thinking that, this is our time to dominate this division. And then all of a sudden, it looks like the Packers are going to be a little bit better than advertised, a little bit faster than advertised. And that's because Jordan Love has played incredibly well. And the reason why I think that, a lot of people don't like Jordan Love for whatever reason. That maybe it's like the pro Rodgers camp that still hates Green Bay, whatever the case. But what he proved this past year, I think, and again, it's a small sample size because he only really came out in the second half of the year, was that he can make just about all the throws, has decent elusiveness from the pocket, and, has decent enough awareness and presence to make plays. And he made a lot of plays throughout the course of the year in the second half en route to getting his team into the playoffs. So when you look at it from that angle, it looks like, he's a good player who has the potential to continue to get better. He's still in his mid-20s, so he's going to be good, right? Then you got Detroit now, who's in win now mode. They're trying to maximize what they have with Jared Goff, Jameson Williams, Aiden Hutchinson, all these young players that they have surrounded him. And they're going to be explosive. And I think it's going to be, these are two teams that are going to finish with over 10 wins this year. I would imagine both of them are going to qualify for the playoffs. One of them is a wild card. And, it's going to be an interesting division, one of the probably more competitive divisions in the NFC or in the NFL as a whole. So that is something exciting to think about if you watch a lot of NFC North football. But I do want to kind of comment here on the position that Jordan Love is in. It's not easy to come in after a legend. We saw Mac Jones in New England fall on his face when this happened, right? He was following the greatest quarterback ever, Tom Brady, and he fell on his face. Couldn't get it done. Granted, the front office in New England didn't do him any favors with the players they brought in, but at the end of the day, he was making bad reads, bad throws, and now he's a backup in Jacksonville to Trevor Lawrence. So when you're in a situation where you're following a legend, you think about Denver. They have Peyton Manning in the twilight of his career, won a Super Bowl. Then he left, and they haven't been able to figure out since they're on another drafted quarterback in Bo Nix, and they're trying to resuscitate Zach Wilson. And it's just incredibly difficult to follow somebody who is a franchise legend and just an NFL legend, period, in the case of Peyton Manning. With Jordan Love, he's following two legends. He's following Aaron Rodgers, who won a Super Bowl, who was All-Pro a number of times, who is considered probably one of the most gifted physical athletes and physical passers of the football that we have seen in many years. Rodgers himself followed another legend, Brett Favre, who also won a Super Bowl and was a multiple-time MVP and for a while was the best quarterback in the league. So you have back-to-back Hall of Fame careers in Green Bay, and you have to follow that up. The pressure is insane. It's an incredible amount of pressure because the fan base now is accustomed to winning and winning at a high level, or at least, winning at the division, right? Now, granted, you could make the argument that the Favre and Rodgers era, in retrospect, is a little bit of a disappointment because how do you only get 2 Super Bowls in 30 years when you have 2 elite talents at the quarterback position? But nonetheless, that is who this guy is replacing. And I don't think we've seen it too often in sports where you have an important position like quarterback and you have 2 generations of elite players that played in a stop for well over a decade. It just doesn't happen, right? And like usually after a legend leaves in any position, there's a drop off. But there wasn't really much of a drop off with Rodgers after Favre. And Love has shown there isn't too much of a drop off from Rodgers to Jordan Love. But there is just an insane amount of pressure, especially when you consider that this is in Green Bay, Wisconsin. Green Bay is by far the smallest media market of any pro team in the United States. No disrespect or anything here, but Green Bay exists and lives for the Packers. That is the main attraction. Lambeau is the main attraction for that city, for that town. It has a real small town type feel, right? Where it's not like playing in Chicago or New York or LA or Miami. It's not even like playing in a smaller market like Jacksonville, where it's just so community-based. A team doesn't have an owner, which you can also argue might limit them from a flexibility position in free agency. It's why a lot of the Packers' great players are drafted, not traded or signed for, right? Because they do great in the draft. They've always done great in the draft. And their biggest free agency hit of all time is probably Reggie White, which you could argue is the best free agency move of all time, just considering how he brought them to a Super Bowl shortly after being signed alongside Brett Favre. But there's a lot of pressure that comes with A, following 2 great players, and B, playing in a city that sole focus is on you from an athletics perspective. Because they don't have a team elsewhere. You could argue the Milwaukee element, but that's like over an hour and a half, 2 hours away from Green Bay. There's a little bit of a distance there, right? And they have like the University of Wisconsin at Green Bay, who's had, some success in college basketball, doesn't really play football at a high level. So it's really just the Packers, right? And they love the Packers. And they will always love the Packers because that's the seminal hometown team. They're one of the original franchises in the NFL, so they really hold a lot of weight in the town and really the whole state of Wisconsin. So to walk into that situation where you really can't hide, right? Everything is, you're front and center. You're the quarterback of the Green Bay Packers. in Green Bay, that's like being the shortstop for the Yankees. That's it's like being the star player for the Lakers. It's just like the quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys, right? These are positions that have a lot of pressure attached to them. And the this is what Jordan Love is coming into. He went to Utah State. It wasn't a big school, plays in the Mountain West. So maybe from that aspect, he's kind of comfortable with the small town feel, right? But it wasn't like he was some guy who was on the spotlight. And now he comes into Green Bay, which is by nature a franchise that gets covered pretty decently because of their history, because of the quarterbacks that they've had in the past. And I think in his first year, he has just navigated that tremendously and shown that he is more than capable of continuing to be able to navigate it. And ultimately, that's why they re-signed him to the contract, because if he couldn't handle it or they thought he was cracking under the pressure that comes with Green Bay, they wouldn't have given him the extension, right? Like, you can't handle this. We'll let you go in free agency. We'll figure out a new path, whether finding it, a stopgap solution like Gardner Minshew and then drafting the next guy or whatever, or just straight up drafting somebody and throwing them into the fire. Whatever the case, it seems like they identified the right personality fit for their franchise, and that's why they paid him the money. And it kind of brings me to the money aspect, right? So I feel like we, as a viewing public, place a little bit too much emphasis on dollar amount when it comes to how players get paid. It's kind of like a weird thing. Like, we don't really watch the results on the field as much without associating them to the money they're making. So if somebody is making $40 million a year and they throw an interception or they fumble the ball, whatever, you're just kind of like, oh, what am I paying this guy $40 million for? And I kind of always felt that, I wrote an article about this a while ago, where I think we need to stop looking at the overall dollar amount and think of it more holistically in the sense of how much of the cap does this player's contract take, right? Now, Jordan Love takes a pretty considerable amount of the cap, closer to 30% of the team's cap. And that's a lot, right? But I think that's how we should acknowledge it, as opposed to, well, he's paying $55 million per year. We need to really focus in on what percentage of this team's payroll is being allocated to one player, because that gives us context. Like, if you really think about it, like back in the 90s when Troy Aikman was playing, he was making like 8, 9, 10 million. That still basically mirrored the percentage of the cap at the time that Dak Prescott makes today. So when people say, oh, I can't believe Dak is making 40 million, but, Aikman only made a quarter of that, it's kind of a bad faith argument, because they're making the same percentage of the cap. So, a team has a certain amount of money to work with, and that's kind of agreed upon in the CBA and all that, and they're just giving them percentages, right? So I always felt that was a bad faith argument. But when it comes to QBs, here's what's going to happen. A couple years ago, the Giants gave Daniel Jones a contract, right? It made him the highest paid quarterback at the time. He's making like 40-some million a year. Now, after a few years and some extensions have hit, that contract is getting lower and lower and lower and lower in the rankings. So by the time it's over, it'll probably be a middle of the pack contract, right? It's because the quarterback position is so coveted, it's so valued, it's so important. They're always going to give big money to keep a guy. So much so that you may look at it and say, hey, look, this guy is okay. He's not shitty, but he's also not Patrick Mahomes or Joe Burrow, right? But can I see him being on the periphery of the top 5? If the answer is yes, you're going to pay that guy, because it's better to have a top 6 quarterback than to, have somebody who is just no good, right? Or inexperienced or can't grasp the playbook or whatever the case may be. The position is so important to winning in the NFL that players and teams will negotiate contracts in huge numbers, because you got to have the quarterback. Even if you're not convinced he's a top tier quarterback, Patrick Mahomes don't grow on trees, right? So That is why Jordan Love got paid, because his time was now to re-up, and it was an important position of value. And if you don't have it, you're going to lose. So let's say they don't do it, he plays out the string, he goes into free agency. What do the Packers do next offseason? Do they try to draft somebody? Do they try to lure whoever free agents in? So, like, the best QB free agent this year was Kirk Cousins. So then you start looking at it right now. If you're Green Bay, it's like, all right, you could the path of free agency leads us to a player that is maybe of the caliber of Kirk Cousins. Then you look at what you have now. Here's Jordan Love, no injuries, younger, and probably a decent approximation of the skill set that Kirk Cousins has right now. So you signed the contract. In a year or two, while they're midway through this contract extension, that annual average value is going to drop and drop and drop and drop, because more and more players are going to get their money, more and more players are going to sign their extensions, and the salary cap keeps on going up because the NFL as a product keeps on going up. As the media deals continue to get negotiated, the NFL right now, I would say, in the United States, is the most valuable media rights entity. The NBA just signed an extension on or a new media deal for billions of dollars over 11 years across 4 or 5 different networks. That's the power of live sports. And here's a newsflash. People watch the NFL a lot more than they watch the NBA. So just imagine what that next NFL media deal is going to be like. And when the media deal goes up, so do player contracts as part of the revenue sharing agreement, right? So I kind of don't really like when people get all bent out of shape about a contract. Well, first of all, you're not paying it, right? Second of all, you got to look at it in the sense of the total picture. If you look at $55 million per year in a vacuum, yeah, of course, it looks huge, especially when you compare it in a vacuum to people in the past. But when you look at it in relativity to the actual salary cap and how that's increasing and the machinations of it in that way, then it's not a big deal. And at the end of the day, you want to retain your quarterback. You want to keep your quarterback, and the only way to do that is to pay money. Now, you can also make that same type of argument that, hey, him taking all this money now is going to hamstring them with the rest of their roster. And that's true. And that's something that the Packers have to figure out. Luckily, as we talked about earlier, the Packers are really good at scouting. They're really good at drafting. So they're probably going to have a little roulette board kind of in the door, out the door of rookies and low contract value veterans and all that they could kind of really piece together this roster. I still think they'll probably need a playmaker on defense, like an edge rusher. That's a big name that gets big money, and probably maybe even a receiver, one of those two. But once they do that, I think this is a team that could go far. And you may not agree that Jordan Love is the answer for them or could ever win a Super Bowl. That remains to be seen. But the way the Packers saw it was he showed us a lot. We believe in him. We scouted him at Utah State. We think he has the goods. Let's just go ahead and lock him up and see what happens. So let's see what unfolds. All right, so that is going to wrap up another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. Fun note, this was actually episode 20. So thank you to everybody who's been following along, listening, subscribing, watching the clips on TikTok and Instagram. Really do appreciate all the support. But until next time, my name is Omar Zaran, and we will catch you later.